My brain is sort of like a sponge, drifting through the waters of Pokémon knowledge and occasionally releasing it in a deluge whenever somebody brings up something tangentially related to a fact I know. Then I realized I could wring out a bunch of the fun facts I have rattling around in my head into a video, and make them ever so slightly less obscure. So if you're a fact fan like me, be sure to subscribe, and let's dive into some of the Pokémon trivia of varying degrees of usefulness. The Poison Terra Crown is the only one that doesn't appear in any required fights in the main game or DLC of Scarlet and Violet. The only opponent who actively uses this Terra type is Nurse Miriam, one of the potential opponents in the rematches of the Academy Ace tournament. Doing at least one tournament is required to reach the final epilogue Mochi Mayhem, but she will never appear in the scripted first run of the tournament, so battling her is entirely optional. In a similar vein, there are only a handful of times that seeing a Pokemon terrastalize is absolutely required. If a trainer who can terrastalize begins the turn with the Pokemon they are scripted to Terra on the field, they will use their Terra Orb on that turn. This means there exists a narrow window between their Terra Pokemon being sent out and the beginning of the next turn for them to take damage. If their Terra Pokemon is dragged out by a move like Roar or Whirlwind just in time for the move Future Sight or Doom Desire to hit it, then it's possible to knock it out before the opponent gets a chance to terrastalize, skipping being forced to see that Terra Crown. The player is also only ever required to use their Terra Orb once in the entire game, with the forced terrastalization against the Paradise Protection Protocol even if the player doesn't choose to activate their Terra Orb. The game will eventually force Koraidon and Miraidon to terrastalize and use Terra Blast even if the player continues to ignore their friends telling them they should do exactly that. As for wild Pokemon terrastalizations, we have the multi-stage boss fight against Ogerpon in each of her terrastalized mask forms at the end of Teal Mask, the wild Stellar Pokemon that must be defeated to progress through the Area Zero Underdepths, and finally the battle against Stellar Terrapagos at the end of the Indigo Disc. Across the mainline games, behind the standard Pokeball and the Cherish Ball, the Pokeball that can contain the most different types of Mythicals is the Luxury Ball. Since Generation 3 introduced it, the Luxury Ball has been available to use in encounters with Mew, Deoxys, Darkrai, Shaman, Arceus, Victini, Keldeo, Meloetta, Genesect, Diancie, Volcanion, Zeraora, Meltan, and Pecharunt. What sets the Luxury Ball specifically apart from the other Pokeballs one could use in these encounters is the existence of the Bank Apology Celebi that was distributed in a Luxury Ball. Because Celebi's only catchable encounter is in Generation 2, its ball is not saved and will be a standard Pokeball when transferred, making this event the only time it was available outside a Pokeball or a Cherish Ball. And if we include Pokemon Go, the Great Ball, Ultra Ball, and Master Ball eclipse the Luxury Ball by being able to capture Hoopa, Zarude, and Melmetal. Theoretically, the Great Ball and Ultra Ball could also be used on Celebi in Pokemon Go, but only when oversights cause rare lapses of the forced Pokeball system during their research encounter. As of writing, only a single mythical, Pecharunt, cannot be obtained in a Cherish Ball. Bione is a close second, only being available in a Cherish Ball from specifically My Pokemon Ranch as one of Haley's in-game trades. Starting in Generation 4, each Pokemon was given a characteristic, which is determined by their highest IV. Whenever a Pokemon has 2 or more IVs that are tied for the highest, the tie is broken by looking at their personality value. For example, Toast, my Shadow Scizor, has 0 in all his IVs. This is just something that all the Shadow Pokemon found in the Cardi room from Colosseum have, and no one is really sure why. Since there's a tie for the highest IV in Generation 4, the game picks a starting point for breaking the tie by dividing his PID by 6. In this case, the remainder is 3, so starting with Speed, the game looks for an IV that is part of the tie. And since Speed counts for this, his characteristic is set to Likes to Run. In Generation 5, the way a Pokemon's characteristic is chosen was changed extremely slightly. When determining a characteristic, the game starts off by choosing HP as the highest, and then goes in order until it finds an IV higher than HP. Breaking ties the same way as Generation 4 if any new highest IV is found. If a Pokemon's IVs are all 0 and its characteristic isn't already based on its HP, it will be changed to Loves to Eat when transferred from Generation 4 to 5, and will remain Loves to Eat in every game going forward, except in the mobile version of Pokemon Home, which for some reason uses the same method as Generation 4. The only mark that can never legally appear on a shiny Pokemon is the Titan mark, which only appears on the shiny locked static encounters where you rematch each of the Titan Pokemon in Scarlet and Violet. At 6 species total, the Titan mark is also the mark that can be attached to the fewest different species. The mark with the next fewest species available, the Mightiest mark, is only available on one shiny, Mew, who can obtain it from defeating the 7-star Mewtwo raid event. When that raid event released, the Mightiest mark also received an errata to its description. While before it said it was a mark for Pokemon caught from a 7-star Terra raid battle, because of Mew it now reads as a mark for an especially mighty Pokemon. The species of Pokemon that can be obtained with the most different marks is Dragonite, who achieves this by being able to obtain every regularly available wild mark, but also snags the Fishing, Alpha, and Mightiest mark, only missing out on the Titan mark and the Curry mark. Second place, however, is a massive tie between the Pikachu, Magikarp, Eevee, and Chewtle lines, as well as Tyranitar, Metagross, and Garchomp. Each misses the Titan mark, as well as 2 other marks from among the Curry, Fishing, Mightiest, and Alpha mark. Chewtle gets the Curry and Fishing mark, Magikarp gets the Fishing and Alpha marks, and Pikachu, Eevee, and the pseudo-legendaries get the Mightiest and Alpha mark. While other species available in 7-star Terra raids like Goodra, Venusaur, Typhlosion, and Porygon 2 can also get the Alpha and Mightiest mark, they are unable to obtain the Dry mark only available on wild Pokemon found in Galar during intense sunlight weather. Up until Scarlet and Violet, the only Pokemon that could get every single mark was Octillery, who is the only Pokemon that can have the Curry, Fishing, and Alpha mark, but its absence from Scarlet and Violet denies it the Destiny, Jumbo, Mini, Partner, Item Finder, and Gourmand mark. The Pokemon with access to the highest number of titles is Pikachu, and by extension, Raichu. Of the regularly available titles, Pikachu only misses the Catch of the Day from the Fishing mark, the Curry Connoisseur from the Curry mark, and the former Titan from the Titan mark. Pikachu achieves this by having had at one point or another at least one distribution with each available event ribbon, except for the Battle Champion ribbon, the National ribbon, Country ribbon, and the World ribbon, as well as the unreleased event ribbon titles such as the National Champion, the Regional Champion, and the Record Holder. Of the Paradox Pokemon in Generation 9, 3 pairs are variants of the same Pokemon in the present day, these being Donphan, Volcarona, and Cyclizar. Of these pairs, the past Paradoxes are all fighting types, with Great Tusk, Slitherwing, and Koraidon respectively. Also on the topic of past Paradox Pokemon, Koraidon and Screamtail are the only 2 that don't take direct reference from their current day counterparts as Shiny Pal. In the case of Screamtail specifically, it has the coloration of a shiny Igglybuff rather than its counterpart Jigglypuff. Sinnoh Route 201 normally has an even split between Starly and Bidoof, and it's also home to all of the normal encounter table modifiers in Generation 4, with Doduo appearing in Swarms, Nidoran appearing in the radar-exclusive Fast Grass, and Growlithe appearing as a dual-slot encounter with Fire Red inserted. But in Diamond and Pearl specifically, for whatever reason, Starly will steal Bidoof's 4% encounter slot if any GBA cartridge other than Fire Red is inserted, making it a 54-46 split instead, and also making this route one of the only areas that has a different encounter table no matter which GBA cartridge you have inserted. Did you know that you can bully the shopkeeper in Kitakami into upgrading her store to accept League points? When you first arrive, you can only buy things using cash. If you try to use your LP, she will ask you if it's one of those cryptic currencies she's heard so much about lately. Insisting that you'd like to pay with League points 2 more times will get her to look into upgrading the payment system. And after the beginning of the next in-game day, she will be able to accept League point payment. In certain side modes throughout the series, the standard Pokeballs are used to name the progressive ranks of difficulty on offer, with the standard rank being called normal rank. In Japanese, these Pokeballs are called the Super Ball, Hyper Ball, and Master Ball, which is reflected in the ranks of the Generation 3 contests, which was also how they appeared in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. In Generation 4, the middle 2 ranks were changed to be the Great Rank and Ultra Rank to match the English nomenclature with the Great Ball and Ultra Ball. Then, the Battle Royal in Alola still uses the normal, Super, Hyper, and Master Rank system, and then finally, in imitation of Diamond and Pearl, BDSP changed back to using Great and Ultra. Fire Red and Leaf Green were the first games in the series to introduce different sprites for each type of TM when viewed in the player's bag. There exists an unused sprite for this, however, as Generation 3 has no Bug-type TMs. Emerald introduced new sprites for the TM pocket in the player's bag, and while the Bug-type TM sprite in this bag is unused, it would be reused later in the series in the Generation 4 game, which introduced multiple Bug-type TMs such as U-Turn. While most contest opponents in Generation 3 have names that are simple rearrangings of their species' name, this doesn't apply to all of them. Some opponents like Raikou the Manectric and Duodo the Dodrio found in Emerald are actually evolved versions of the Electrike and Doduo opponents found in Ruby and Sapphire that one might expect from their names. In a similar vein, in Emerald, Lurkey is a Kirlia as the name suggests, but for some reason back in Ruby and Sapphire their name was Shedja. Equally strange, both Totdil and Diltot are both opponents added in Emerald. While the names might lead you to believe that they'd both be the same species, Totodile, while that's true for Totdil, Diltot is a Dunsparce. The dive ball introduced in Ruby and Sapphire initially only offered a bonus in maps that are specifically coded to be underwater locations, accessed with dive in specific spots in the Hoenn Ocean. There is, however, one other underwater map in all of Generation 3, found in Pokémon Colosseum. The Phoenix Stadium here is coded to be an underwater location, presumably only coded as such because there is a nature power wielding Nuzleaf in the gauntlet here, that the developers wanted to be able to call a move appropriately themed to this environment in Hydro Pump, which is what nature power turns into underwater. Even though they can only be accessed by trading with other Generation 3 games, the dive ball is fully functional in Colosseum. While no shadow Pokemon can be snagged inside Phoenix Stadium in the main story, the Japanese exclusive Card E room does place 3 unique shadow Pokemon trainers there. And because the game treats this map as an underwater location, the dive ball receives its 3.5 times multiplier on these Pokemon. While there are shadow Pokemon to snag in Phoenix Stadium and XD Gale of Darkness, none of the fights take place after the player gets access to trading in dive balls. And our last fact for tonight, there are several moves that change their attack animation depending on whether or not the user is shiny. But the stranger part is that what happens when a Pokemon copies these signature moves is handled differently for nearly every one of them. In Ultra Sun and Moon as well as Sword and Shield, Blacephalon's Mind Blown sees it toss its head up into the air before detonating, and if a shiny Pokemon happens to use Mind Blown, the head will also be shiny. Meanwhile, Eternatus and Dragapult have moves with similar slight shiny variations, but if another Pokemon copies Eterna Beam or Dragon Darts, a genericized version of the animation will play that doesn't feature any of the changes. Further still, in Paldea we have the signature move of Dipplin and Hydrapple, Syrup Bomb, which features yellow syrup on its animation and end-of-turn visual effect. If a Pokemon other than Dipplin or Hydrapple attempts to use Syrup Bomb, however, the effect will always be red, even if the new user happens to be shiny. But with that, we've covered all the fun facts I have for you today. Let me know which ones you knew and which ones surprised you in the comments below, and tell me if you like this format where I info-dump semi-obscure Pokemon knowledge without a particular theme. In any case, thanks for listening to my musings about Pokemon minutia, and thanks for watching.